Many Christians struggle to defend the truth of the Christian worldview. But what if there's a podcast dedicated to answering the toughest objections against Christianity? That's the mission of the Daily Apologist podcast. I'm your host, Dean Meadows, and today I sit down with New Testament scholar Craig A. Evans to talk about whether or not the passion narratives in the Gospels are historically reliable. So I'm here with Dr. Evans, and Dr. Evans, for those of us who are listening or will tune in at some point in the future who may not be familiar with your work or with you, why don't you just go ahead and take the first couple of minutes of our time together and just give us a synopsis of who you are, what your research interests are, basically your background.
I grew up in Southern California, and when I went to university, I was thinking of going to law school. So I went to Claremont McKenna College. It was Claremont Men's College when I went. And it specializes, at that time, it still does, preparing people for law school and business school and things like that, government. So I wanted to go to law school. So I went there, and interestingly enough, my interest in Christian faith, Christian origins greatly increased. And by the time I was a senior, I had changed my mind. I didn't want to go to law school. In the summer, before graduating, I had visited law schools up and down the coast, including Stanford. And I decided, no, I want to go to seminary, and I want to get into biblical studies and theology and go from there. I'd always had interest in history. So when I got to seminary, I discovered, wow, this is really neat. There's a historical context, both for Old Testament and New, and fantastic scholars in the past have worked in this field. I always thought, oh, well, you go to Bible college, there are all these pious people and goody two-shoes and everything else. I had played sports, and had mixed it up. And, I didn't see myself as a saintly little Sunday school person. But I got to seminary, and there were guys, we had a linebacker from Arkansas who was one of our students. We had an Olympic light heavy weightlifter who was there. I realized, holy smokes, these guys, these are good athletes. I barely made the basketball team, for weekends. I didn't even try out for the flag football team. So I was impressed. Well, I enjoyed Greek and did well and didn't have too much trouble with Greek or Hebrew. Took classical Greek. And I decided about halfway through my senior year, that perhaps I should pursue a PhD. So I returned to California, Southern California, to Claremont, to the graduate school, which did a PhD in conjunction with the School of Theology across the street. And I had the opportunity to study with some great people. And I took seminars, advanced seminars in New Testament and Old, and wrote a dissertation on Isaiah. And in 1980, I had the chance to take a teaching position, a one-year position in Canada at McMaster University, where E.P. Sanders was, who was by that point well known for his Paul and Palestinian Judaism, which revolutionized study in Paul and how Paul understood the law, grace, justification, things like that, over against Judaism. And so, of course, I saw myself just as much as an Old Testament scholar, but I got hired as a New Testament person. And I thought, oh, I better pull up my socks. And so I started talking about Jesus's use of Isaiah in the New Testament, Isaiah in the Targum, the Aramaic paraphrase, and so on. And so I emerged in the 1980s as a New Testament person with a lot of interest in Jewish interpretation of Scripture, its original setting, that kind of, and of course I had facility with Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, stuff like that, not just Greek and Latin. And so I was well equipped, and so I emerged, and of course in the 1980s, the Jewish rediscovery of Jesus was taking place.
Mm-hmm.
And the third quest of the historical Jesus got underway with a bang, and I participated in that. The Dead Sea Scrolls, by the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, the rest of the scrolls were being published. I was going to Israel regularly. I was getting involved in archaeology. Archaeology suddenly exploded too. And so I was right in the middle of very interesting things, still am. And texts that were being discovered, published, more texts, the papyri, on it goes. So that's been my career. and I found it extremely refreshing. It's been fun to be part of this, publishing new texts, new findings, and reconsidering old ideas that weren't always very good.
One of the things that I am familiar with regards to your work is your extensive work on the burial narratives with regards to Jesus. And for maybe the layman who isn't familiar with this discussion, with this, I would even say to a large degree that the conflict that has emerged, especially where I do my work on social media, which probably isn't the how do I say it, the epicenter of scholarly work, but it is out there, and a lot of young people are being influenced by some popular YouTubers, popular people on social media. And so my next question is, why does the burial narrative of Jesus and the narratives that are there, why do they matter in relation to two things? One, the resurrection of Jesus, but two, the historical reliability of the Gospels.
Yeah, great question. And both of those things come together with the burial that weekend because Passion Week is the week that gets the most attention in the four Gospels. And the death of Jesus gets referenced, more than anything else elsewhere in the New Testament. Paul just beats it to death how often he refers to the death, the crucifixion of Jesus, and his being raised up. And his being raised up presupposes his being buried. And so, if the Gospels have that all botched up, they don't know what they're talking about. That's a serious problem. So, it's a serious problem historically. And then theologically, it becomes a problem too, because the resurrection presupposes that Jesus has been raised up from the grave. And if they don't even have the story right about the burial, one can imagine grounds for suspicion. Well, maybe they don't have the story right about the resurrection either. I mean, what's going on? Are we talking history? Or are we talking about personal experiences, visions, dreams? Who knows what? Is it all subjective? So the burial of Jesus is important. And the thing about it, as I explained to students, history can only do so much. Like, I think historians can make an overwhelming case in support of Jesus' death on a Roman cross. And just about everybody concedes that anyway. It's hardly disputed. So Jesus dies on a cross. Well, history can marshal the support of that, circumstantial, direct testimony, literary evidence, archaeological support, and so on and so forth. But theologically, how in the world can you establish that Jesus died for sinners?
Mm-hmm.
Or that he's atoned for sin? Now you've moved into a theological, confessional thing that is talking about something else. So we have to always keep in mind that you have history on the one hand, and you have a theological inference or conviction, insight, maybe even inspiration, maybe even revelation on the other. And so we can say a lot about the history of Jesus's death, the political factors that went against him, why he was arrested, interrogated, the cogency of it, the coherence of the charges brought against him, brought to Pilate, why Pilate would react the way he did, Jesus' death, his crucifixion, his burial, and the discovery of the tomb Sunday morning. We can talk all about that from a historical point of view. And then after doing that, we can then say, okay, given a whole lot of factors, what makes the most sense theologically? And well, this
Mm-hmm.
is how his following reacted, and that's historical. Their reactions. We can talk about that. This Peter was discouraged. Now he believes in him. Other disciples had run away. Now they believe in him. Paul persecuted the church, thought it was a heresy. He meets the risen Christ, as he himself says, and it changes everything. So the history is very important. It's extremely important. It isn't everything, but it's a lot. And if the history crumbles, there's a problem. Now, when you ask about the burial, the death of Jesus, his burial, the discovery of the tomb, just looking at the historical things, leaving out all of the eschatology, the theology, the metaphysics, leaving that all out, I find it interesting that archaeologists will look at the gospel narratives. Shimon Gibson, for example, with whom I have dug, at Mount Zion in Jerusalem. Jody Magnus, whom I know, and I've visited her dig site at Hukok in Galilee. She's an archaeologist. She's at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And both of these archaeologists, and they're good biblical scholars as well, they've said the Gospels got it right. Now, they're both Jewish. So it's not like they're trying to defend Christianity. There's no
Yeah.
apologetic going on. They don't have a dog in the fight in that sense. But speaking as historians and archaeologists say the Gospels got it right. They're not making any mistakes here.
So that leads me to a couple of questions. One I'll save for later, but I'll just go with what I have right now. So we often hear when minimal facts approach is given. Dr. Gary Habermas has mentioned these before. Dr. Mike Licona has mentioned these before. Where is the scholarship with regards to Jesus being buried in a tomb? Is there a majority that say, yeah, he was buried in a tomb, or does the majority swing to some of the more common practices of Rome?
Well, hold on. What are the common practices? That was a bone of contention between me and Bart Ehrman at a SBL meeting a few years ago. And the Roman law does not forbid burial even of crucified people, executed people. Now, if you're guilty of high treason, you raised an army, you attempted to assassinate Caesar, that might be another matter. But the Roman law in the Digesta, and I remember debating this with Bart. He says, "Oh, that's 6th century." Well, yeah, it was compiled in the 6th century, but the actual material I'm citing goes back to Augustus. So it's late 1st century BC, early 1st century AD, and then some other jurists add to it in the 1st century and the 2nd century. So it's perfectly early, and you can get permission. But to bury, no matter where you've been crucified in the Roman Empire. But the real question is, what was the practice in Israel itself during peacetime?
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I dispute with John Dominic Crossan on this. He gets teary-eyed and said, I think of all those thousands of Jews who were crucified, and we've only found one person with, and one nail properly buried. Well, I love his Irish brogue, and he's wonderful as a communicator, and he's a great guy. We're good friends, but that's factually incorrect. We found a bunch of other nails, actually. I've looked at a human hand with a nail still in it, and
wow.
a lot of this stuff is somewhat under wraps because the ultra-Orthodox, want all this stuff buried. I can't even tell you who has these bones. I mean, I can when we're not on the air, because the ultra-Orthodox would storm his office because, human remains are supposed to be buried. But anyway, the point is, during peacetime, people were buried. We know that because Josephus tells us that in Jewish war. And again, he has no theological dog in the fight. He's not talking about Jesus or Christianity. And he's outraged that the Jewish priests who were murdered by the rebels were not properly buried. And he said, we bury everybody, even those who are crucified. Well, stop and think. Who crucified people in the 1st century? Well, the Romans did. That's conceded by Josephus. It's conceded by the author of the Gospel of John. That is not in dispute. So only by Roman authority can you crucify somebody in Israel. And yet Josephus says they're buried. See, and so that, I think that supports that. That shows what's going on. And so the gospel writers are completely consistent with what's known from the actual facts and from history. And so that's why Jody Magnus says, yeah, the Gospels are right. That's why Shimon Gibson says, the Gospels are right. Jesus most certainly would have been buried. Here's the other thing that's important too. The burial, burying people who were executed, that would be Jesus and the 2 men crucified with him in the 30s, either the year 30 or 33. It wasn't out of sympathy for them. It wasn't out of sympathy for their families. It was because, and the ruling priest would insist on it, is so you don't defile the land.
Mm-hmm. Per
It always goes
Deuteronomy.
back to Deuteronomy 21. And I remember Bart Ehrman one time, he snarkily said, well, I don't think Pilate ever read Deuteronomy. Well, doggone it, that's not what I'm saying. Of course, Pilate, he doesn't do home Bible study. Hey, what are we going to read this week? Let's do Deuteronomy 21. Of course not. Of course not.
Of course he wouldn't. He doesn't care.
He doesn't care. And I'm not trying to make him into a saint. I'm not trying to say he was a good guy. I'm not trying to say he was hoping to find the truth or he was committed to justice. No. He was a governor at least 10 years, maybe even longer, and was making money. But he wasn't as violent as some people say. You know, I remember Dom Cross and I, we were in a Dateline program, and he said, Pilate summed up his administration in one word, you know, what did he say? Bloodshed, you know, or something like that. Well, no, he didn't. He ruled for at least 10 years, which is very long. Most governors are 2 years or 4 years.
Yeah.
He was governor for at least 10 years, and he had only 2 violent clashes, and it was with the Samaritans that resulted in his removal from office. And so the idea that slaughter, you know, that's all he wanted to do is kill people, that's silly. He was
bloodthirsty murderer.
No, he was a politician. Most of the time, he's at Caesarea Maritima on the beach. If you've ever been there, he's staying in Herod the Great's palace. You wouldn't want to go anywhere else. Why would you want to go to dreary old Jerusalem? Well, he would do that politically. Okay, here I am. I know it's Passover, which for like Christians would be like Christmas. Okay, I'm here. And just to show you that Rome's not horrible, we'll release somebody, you know, because I understand what Passover's about. Escape from, you know, foreign domination. Okay. Here, just call out a name and I'll let some guy go. So that's the Passover part. That's just pure politics.
Yeah. So that leads me to a couple other questions. Since you've answered, I've got a list here of about question 3 through 6, right there with that last statement with regards to practices of not just crucifixion but burial. You mentioned some things with regards to what Pilate said to Jesus and the scene with Jesus and Barabbas. Wouldn't the skeptic just say to you, well, you don't, how do you even know that dialogue between Jesus and Pilate took place? And there's no extra biblical there's no extra biblical evidence that would suggest that the Romans handed over a criminal during the Passover based upon a Jewish request. How would you respond to that type of charge against?
We have other examples of it, so I think that skepticism is just uninformed.
What are some of those examples?
Well, in my commentary on Mark, I list them. We have a papyrus where the governor says, "Look, I offered to hand him over to you, you know, to release. Handing over is to release. If he doesn't hand you over, he delivers you up to his soldiers to have you put to death." And that's exactly what happened to Jesus. So we have references in Jewish sources to people being released from prison at Passover. And we have Philo angrily denouncing the Flaccus, the Egyptian Roman governor, for not showing mercy to people who were condemned at a holiday time. By the way, the holiday was Caesar's birthday. And there are other examples of that too. So the idea that we have no evidence, that's the classic argument from silence. It says, if we lack the specific evidence we'd like to have, that becomes evidence that it didn't happen. And that's a logical fallacy. Look, folks, we're talking about ancient history. 2,000 years ago, we are missing many, many, many dots, but we do have a few dots that we can connect. And so we have to argue from analogy and circumstantial evidence often, because what else can we do? That otherwise we just quit and say we can't do any historiography at all if it's earlier than, say, 200 years ago. And so we just have lots of gaps in our knowledge. So when we actually have other sources that talk about Roman governors or Jewish authorities releasing people at holidays, calling for the release of somebody, if we actually have that, then the gospel narrative fits. And again, that's why I keep going back to Shimon Gibson and Jody Magnus. That's why they say, yeah, that fits the sources. To say it fits the sources doesn't prove it really did happen, but it does fit the sources, and it provides no ground for objection. So if somebody objects, that's just a gratuitous objection, especially when they say, well, how would they know this or how would they know that?
What a great answer and explanation, Dr. Evans. I really appreciate that. And that wraps up part 1 of our interview on the Passion narratives and if they are historically reliable. So between this episode and part 2, go ahead on over to thedailyapologist.com. We've got blogs, we've got podcasts, we've got videos for you to watch, multiple resources you can use. And also check us out on our social media platforms. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and yes, even TikTok. All of those are at The Daily Apologist. Thank you so much, Dr. Evans, and I can't wait for part 2. But until then, equip yourself to engage culture.